So again, this is my background. As you can see that I did MS and BS in physics before I switched my career to environmental engineering. So this may be relevant for some of you who, I mean, all of you are environmental engineer or civil engineers. But if you, I just want to mention that it's not late to change your career. The main point is you got to enjoy what you do. If you do, it's okay to change career late as I did. It took a lot of struggles initially, but at the end it was worth it. So I did my PhD at University of Colorado Boulder after I did masters in environmental engineering at University of Hawaii and Manoa. And then after PhD, I did a couple of postdocs, one at Stanford University, another at University of Pennsylvania before I moved to UCLA. So first, I want to a little bit talk about my research before I talk more things about the mistakes or the lessons I learned me as a student, as well as a professor now. From my own students, I'm learning what works best for some of them. So I'm going to share them. So this is my research. If you think, this one picture is kind of summarize what I do in my lab or we do in our lab. So what we do at the fundamental level is we probe the physical and chemical process and to some extent biological process at the interface. At the interface means could be solid water interface, that's soil and water in this case, or soil stormwater. It could be solid air interface, and that's basically when the subsurface dry out, the water is moved from pores and then you left behind airs. That change in transition in a medium can affect the contaminant transport. So that's one thing we also look at. At the end, also look at solid air interface pretty recently, where we are examining how wind can affect the transport of some pollutant like microplastics into airs. So there are many applications for this science. One is these are the applications we are currently working on, or at least we have project to support it. The very first one, or by far the majority of the projects, are related to stormwater treatments. As you can see in that center pictures, that's a basically illustration of stormwater treatments. You have stormwater coming from different surface, and you collect them at one locations, and there you put some plants and replace the soil with amendments that can remove some pollutants. And the goal here is that stormwater will get into groundwater and supply more drinking water for us. So we looked at how we can redesign them so that they are more resilient, not just during at the locations, also for future climates. And then a subset of that research is also wildfire, how wildfire impacts or affects the water quality, which is very relevant in future climate, particularly in California. As you can see, there are many wildfires every year. And after the wildfires, there are lots of wildfire residue like ash. They are deposited on the downstream. And we are interested to understand how those wildfire residue would impact water quality. Mostly we are looking for how they change the soil microbiomes in wetland, how that impacts greenhouse gas emissions, how that impacts some other water quality like disinfection byproducts, metals, and other nutrients. And I have also a large set of group respond to this new research area, which is microplastic. As you all know, microplastic is recently suddenly get a lot of attentions, which is expected because we use a lot of plastic materials and we dump them outside. And so we are interested how to detect microplastic, understand their transport in environments and their impact. One of my PhD students working on inhalation risk of microplastics. Once it's in the lung, how that will affect the human health. So again, these are pretty early stage. We have recently got funded from DOE, DOD and DOE on rare earth element extraction from waste like coal ash, electronic waste. So this is a new area in our lab, something that we have not done a lot of research, but at least we are starting. And then also, this is my own interest, something that I was very thankful for some of the students to initiate this research, which is data science in environmental engineering. As you know that environmental engineering, we do monitor a lot of systems. There are lots of data, and most of the time it's very difficult to do a lab scale study that can predict the consequence in the field scale. For instance, if you want to know how effective the stormwater treatment design, we do a very simplified experiment in lab, and that doesn't really simulate many field conditions. So there is a gap between what happens in the lab versus what happens in the field. But then we have lots of field data, which has lots of compounding factors. It's really hard to explain what to make sense of the field data. A lot of times they are so scattered, so many different things that because so many different factors can influence your results. So what we do here is we use machine learning to understand how we can process this data in a way that can give some valuable information. And one of my PhD students, Renan Valenka, he has done some work on this, so I'll just share some of them. So again, I just want to highlight, my lab is a student-driven lab in the sense, which could be, every lab is in the sense. But in particular, in my lab, many of the research was initiated as well as, rapid advancement was done because of these students. So I'm whatever I present here is these are done in the last 3-4 years and 2-3 years, and these are the students who take all the credit for getting those things done or in a level that is very satisfying for me to see at this end. So again, Renan Valenka, he's my first PhD student. He joined in 2017 fall. His research is on climate change impact on subsurface microbiome and as well as water quality. And then second PhD student, Anesbo Thakur, he joined in 2018 fall. His research is mostly on subsurface transport of colloids and using colloids to understand different fundamental processes in subsurface. And then I have hired 2 PhD students, Vera and Anja, the next year, 2019. Vera, Anja did a master's here, like you guys did, before she joined as a PhD student. So Vera's research is microplastic fate and transport in the subsurface. And Anja's research is wildfire residue impacts on water quality. Again, I'll show some of the results. And then Jamie was an undergrad in my lab before she became a master's and now a PhD student in my lab. So she's growing all over from beginning to now. And her research is microplastic suspension by wind and how that affects the inhalation risk. And then my current or the most recent PhD student is Samia. She is among them right now. She's doing a master's now and changed to PhD at the end of the this year, academic year. So technically she's a PhD student. There is no difference between PhD and master students in the first year. You essentially take a lot of classes. So her research is on rare earth element extractions. She will work on how to use different biological organisms as well as different ligands derived from biological process to extract rare earth elements from colas, electronic waste. And then there are many other students that I didn't include here. There are 9 undergrad students currently working with me and 1 postdoc, Thane and Dash. He just started a few months ago. And then we have alumni, 1 PhD students, Mariam Gojars. She graduated, I think, last year. And we have 2 MS students as thesis options, Kami and Alex. They have graduated last few years. And we have also 12 undergrad alumni. So again, I'm listing all those students who has at least published a paper with me. So as you can see, we have 12 plus 9, almost more than 20 undergrad students who I work with. So I really love to work with undergrad teams because they do help us because they comes with a lot of questions. They are curious, they are driven. So it does help both undergrad students as well as undergrads. So we encourage them to publish with us. So this is a just to show, this is a group pictures we took last summer. I think Samia is missing here. And we have a few more students in the lab that we didn't take. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show a few research highlights on this topic. So first thing is PFAS fate and transport. This is a project funded by DoD. Professor Mohanty was a PI in this project, where we had not just to understand fate and transport, but also different treatment methods. So what I'm going to present is the fate and transport part, which is done by Anes. So as you know, PFAS, many of you probably didn't hear about it. If you didn't hear about it, this is PFAS is a surfactant or surfactant-like molecules which are used for different applications, because it's hydrophobic, it's water repellents, it's also fire retardants. It is also dust repellents. So that means many materials where you don't want any to weight it, like tablecloth, or even your cell phone or mobile phone, anywhere you don't want the excess heat to cause fire, or is some place where you use this. In fact, if you take Teflon material, Teflon is PFAS. So if you use any kind of non-stick cookware with made of a Teflon, those has PFAS. So PFAS was extremely resilient. I mean, it's very difficult to destroy them. Or in environmental conditions, they persist for many years, hundreds of years, because it's very difficult to degrade. So what we try to understand is how accumulated those PFAS are moving in the subsurface to groundwater. So what Anes did here is that found out that PFAS, typically people collect samples from water and say this is the PFAS concentrations. But what we found that if you remove those small fine particulates, which is the standard of procedure to detect measure PFAS concentration in water, you remove a very high concentration of PFAS from water. The reason is these PFAS, they are surfactants, so they can bind some of the particulates at the water solid interface. So if you have lots of turbid water, they may have high concentration of PFAS associated with these small fine particles. So if you are removing them before analysis, you are underestimating the concentrations. So that was just one study. And then he did further research to show that these fine particles also enhancing their transport of PFAS in subsurface. So that means if you have a location which has lots of colloid release from subsurface where PFAS was contaminating, then you might expect those groundwater well will have high concentration of PFAS. So examine what the mechanism, how it moves, all these factors was mentioned in these publications. So that's just the one aspect, just to show that how we can use subsurface transport process, or the interaction at the solid air or air-water interface to predict contaminant transport. The next one is microplastic detection, fate, and impacts. We have lots of paper on this. I just want to highlight two papers which are recently published or submitted. The first one is by Jamie. As you can see, what we did with collaboration with Professor Oskan, he is in electrical engineering, is we develop or we use a smartphone to detect microplastics. Normally, how people detect microplastic is a very tedious process. You collect samples, you separate plastics from the environmental other media like soil or other debris, and then you digest the organic. And once you digest the organics, you left with just plastic, because plastics are very difficult to digest in peroxide or other media. And then only they takes into microscope and look at under microscope like FTIR and Raman microscope to see how many plastic particles are there. The entire process could take something between 24 hours to 48 hours, or even longer, based on how long you need for digestions, which is kind of limiting because if it takes so long, there is a limit of how many samples you can analyze per weeks. And that means, you're not really looking at many things that you could otherwise look. So what Jamie did here is that collaborate with our collaborators, Professor Oskan Lab, who has developed this method for other types of materials, not plastic. So we kind of merge them together. So what we found is that we can use a dye that selectively binds on microplastic. And in this case, we use Nile red. So Nile red can dye the plastics and glow in dark under UV lights compared to any other organic debris, for instance, leaves or other part. So that means we eliminate the use of a digestion technique, which could take more than 2 days or one to 2 days. So now it's reduced to a very small small time. And then you use smartphone. Typically, smartphone is not very effective in detecting. If you take pictures on using your smartphone on any dust, you can see that the resolution is low. So what we did as with our collaborator is put this extension, which is basically a camera with all these different a sample holder where we can put the filter materials. And so then there are a few modifications, and there are algorithm they developed which can basically distinguish plastic from any others. And so this is how it looks on the right side. You see that on the insert, these are the yellow dots are microplastics, and we can detect anything as small as 10 microns. Again, the 10 micron is not the limit because we have to check the entire filter, which is 25 mm or millimeters. That's why the smallest you can detect is 10 micron. If you want to go smaller, let's say 1 millimeters, then the detection can be as small as 1 micron. It's like this, if you want to detect a small, let's say your smartphone in 10 football field, your resolution will be very hard. But if you're looking at a very small area, then your resolution can be improved. So this is the first ever methods using smartphone. So this is pretty cool. I'm very excited about this method. And then whereas we took this method, and because we developed this method and we use this methods to measure microplastic in different environments. So what she did with all these undergrad students and all the co-authors you can see is collect samples from Los Angeles at different biofilters or stormwater treatment systems. We take samples at different depth. We also took samples above the stormwater treatment system from leaves. The reason is there was a concern that all the microplastic that are accumulating on this stormwater treatment system could ended up in groundwater. So first question was, is this a risk? Are the microplastic moving downward? And second, how much microplastics are accumulating in the systems? So to do that, normally people measure how much microplastics are in stormwaters, and then they multiply the volume of stormwater that received in this area, then they get the total mass. So that assumption means that you are expecting all the microplastic to come here as in stormwaters. There is no microplastic deposition from air. So we want to disprove it. The reason is microplastics are very light particles, so we know that they will be in air, and there are many studies show that. So we wanted to just create the mass balance or complete the mass balance. So we found that actually that's true. When we collected samples from leaves, we see lots of microplastics. And those leaves should not have microplastic from stormwater because the leaves are way higher on the tree or plants. Not only that, we found that these microplastics are there even the places where there is no stormwater, or at least those areas that doesn't receive any stormwater. So that means if you want to know how much microplastic inventory at a locations, you have to account for both leaves, both air as well as stormwater. And then we found that when we take a different depth profile, we found that the concentrations of microplastic in these biofilters follow exponential model. It means you have very high concentration at the top, then it decreases exponentially. That means within like 10 centimeters or 20 centimeters, you will not see any microplastics. So most of them are filters at the surface. So those are relevant because now we know where they're accumulating and how we can deal with them. So these are different implications. This is just two examples. And we also have studies where we took cores from ocean in Mississippi River deltas, where we took ocean core and we are trying to examine how much microplastic has been accumulated in seabed in last 100 years. And this will tell us, how much microplastic has been accumulating in last different decades. And that will help us to understand how much waste has been produced and how it's correlated with microplastic contaminations. So as you can see, we are looking at microplastic at different levels. And Jamie's research is more on how these microplastics, which are deposited on the surface, can be entrained by wind. Because most of the microplastic you can remove from wastewater treatment plants or stormwater treatment plants, but once they are in the air, there is no barrier. We are going to be inhaling those plastics. So she's looking at those mechanisms. So now switch gear. We, as you know, that data science is the future of big data and all that. So environmental engineering is kind of a little bit behind in that way compared to many other fields. But this is increasingly used. In fact, in water resource engineering, you guys have been using data science or data analysis for a long time to simulate large-scale process. In environmental engineering, traditionally we work on fundamental science at the very micro scale or a small scale. So that's why the data are not very meaningful to extrapolate, but we try to find a way to do it. So I just want to show some of the examples. So this is just one example. That's Vera. She with helps of all these undergrads, Sarah, Jamie was a grad student that time, master students, and Francesca, Albert. What they did is they collect all microplastic concentrations or data related to microplastic concentration in wastewater. So they studied more than hundreds of articles and collected all the samples and did meta-analysis just to see what really affects microplastic concentration and how much is removed. What they found is that wastewater treatment plants remove 90% of the microplastics, or 99%, or nearly 97% that come in the effluent. And so that means, you could expect that those 97% of what you receive should be in the biosolid. But when they measure biosolid concentration or the reported value, we found that more than 90% of plastic that's removed are not accounted for. That means, if you just take the concentration of biosolid and apply them in agriculture, let's say you report only 10 microplastic. The actual number could be 25 times more. So that's just the message that's written here. So as you see, these are the messages you will not find out if you just do one experiment in one wastewater treatment plant. What we did here is that we collect all data and did the data analysis, and we found that this is the case. So that kind of informed what the issues here, and we discover, or we found there are many reasons for it. So Albert is a statistics major. He's an undergrad student in our lab. He helped us do some meta-analysis to understand which factors are likely the cause of this mystery. And there is another review papers, analysis paper, where we examine distribution of microplastic in terrestrial environments. That's led by Vera. Again, these are like hundreds of articles and data, thousands of data. And we found that we found different, there are many messages here. The main point here is that the distribution of microplastic in terrestrial environment varies order of magnitudes, like 6 or 7 order of magnitudes in different locations. And in fact, stormwaters, as well as some other locations, has very high concentration of the microplastic than other places. In fact, one of the surprising factor here is that we found glacier has much higher concentration than expected. If you think of most of the places, you expect the plastic will float on surface stormwaters and deposit at different locations. Glacier, which are far away from most of the location where people are using plastics. So they should not have a lot of high concentration of plastics. But we found that, in fact, they have the highest concentrations, which means that plastics get there by air because, water cannot flow to the glacier upward. So that means, what we found here is that wind has a very significant role. And so these are kind of stuffs that we normally cannot expect. But by using this big data analysis, we find some trends that's otherwise not possible. And then another studies with Sarfraz. He was a PhD student with one of my colleagues, Professor McConnell. So we worked together on understanding where you can use manage aquifer recharge, because you know that this is basically it's a process where you apply stormwater or wastewater or surface water to increase groundwater table. That way, that can be used for drinking water. This is a by far most sustainable method in dry conditions like California. So our goal was to find out at what location implementation of this technology is economical. So we did a lot of analysis. As you can see, analyzing 1,100 Mars sites throughout the world, and we look for the trends, and that helps us to understand where you can apply these systems. This is another, just to show that, we took a lot of data from stormwater treatment systems. This is done by Renan. And we basically examine what kind of treatment design or what kind of factors affect the transport of or removal of nutrients, in this case, nitrogen or nitrate. So again, I just don't want to go through this, just want to show that you can see there are many data here, 146, all that. It gives us a trend or information that otherwise not easy to compare between studies. So this is something I do enjoy working with in futures, because these big data inform engineers to how to design the system. This is another study. Again, most of the data analysis was done by Renan here. And the idea here is to what kind of amendments we can use for stormwater treatments. So as you know that many of you probably, if you heard my research from my PhD students, stormwater treatment is one of the things that we do repeatedly, whether microplastic, whether climate change, somewhere or other we connect with the stormwater treatments. So these are the few studies, just example, so that the research that is published from this work. This was done by Mariam. She was a PhD student who graduated, keep forgetting, last academic year. And she found here that how to minimize the concentrations of pathogens, because a lot of times, every time there is a rainfall happens, the very beginning of the rainfall, you see turbid waters, you see lots of dirty waters, because that's the first flush. That's what we call first flush. Usually those has the highest concentration of pollutants, and that lead to impairment of many surface water. So the goal is how to design this treatment system so that you can decrease that concentrations of contaminants or pathogens in the effluents during the first flush. So what Mariam found here is that if you use some small amount of iron filling or rusted iron, you can diminish that first flush high concentration of pathogen. This is a phenomenon that's discovered, or at least done a lot of research by one of our Professor Stenstrom. So what we did here is that understanding that process, we redesigned or at least we propose a design that could prevent that negative effect. And this is a very recent study that I did during my postdoc, but then I translate and finish it here, is understanding the transport of asbestos. This one of the studies where we found that asbestos are expected not to move in groundwater, but here we discover that actually that's not true. In fact, asbestos can move in groundwater if you have high concentration of organic matters. This organic matter prevent that interactions of asbestos, which are positively charged with soil, so make it more likely to move. So that means if you are taking groundwaters from a location which has asbestos, you are redispersing by irrigations or drinking water, mostly irrigation. If you are irrigating, those asbestos are now being exposed or entrained into air, and that's where it can cause lung toxicity or lung cancers. So this is just one study recently, and this is another studies done by Renan. What he did here is that try to understand what type of biochars one may use to remove pathogens. If many of you probably don't know what is biochar. Biochar is basically organic materials, basically charcoal made out of pyrolysis of organic waste. Biochar properties vary a lot. If you heard about activated carbon, this is basically same thing, low quality activated carbon. So it's basically non-activated charcoal. So their surface properties varies a lot. So it makes it very difficult for engineers or stormwater manager to select a biochar. What Renan did here is that he took all these materials from or look for the known properties like surface area, carbon content, volatile matters, ash content. These are the properties normally reported for biochar. So he did a lot of experiments and found a correlation. And based on that, he can predict if you use certain quality of biochar based on these properties, what could be the removal. So based on this machine learning method, I mean, this is something we can do as a machine learning. We have not done it. We could predict what biochar is useful. So this will really help in the industry select the biochars they need. So this is another study I want to highlight from one of my master students, Wang Le, Camille. She was one of my master students 2 years ago. In fact, she did so well that she won the best master students award in entire engineering school. So this is her research that shows that if you use, so one of the things that concern for these biochars that I just mentioned, that when you apply this biochar in soil, a lot of times you need to compact them based on what's the requirement for the soil stability. And so a lot of times people are not sure what size of biochars to use, and if using different size has an impact. What's discovered here is that if you use small biochars, they are more likely to break compared to the large biochar, which is normally not intuitive. If you take a big charcoal, you expect them to break. Whereas what we found here is that if you take actually small biochar, they break more. So the reason, I mean, she explained that here, basically, if you have a large biochar, it has many contact points around it. So when there is a pressure, the net force for each contact point will be a lot less. So that means the large biochar will be not broken up. Whereas small biochar, the pressure per contact point is so high that it breaks quickly. So that's the idea that that will help engineers to decide what size biochars to use. Again, I don't want to go over through this one. This is another research by Mariam, who graduated, just to show that compaction does affect stormwater treatments. I want to highlight this research at the end. This is basically research done by my first master student, Alex Borger. What he did is he found out that using biochar in stormwater treatment system, particularly with wood chips, you can improve removal of nitrate. Nitrate is a nutrient that cause eutrophications. So it's very difficult to remove by stormwater treatment system because it requires a little bit high hydraulic retention time. It requires also anoxic microorganism, because in presence of oxygen or dissolved oxygen, denitrification is really slow and doesn't happen. Sorry. So we found that if using biochar, that kind of enhances the denitrification process. So the last research I just want to highlight that we do have initial stage of research on how wildfire could impact water quality. The very first research Renan did and found that these wildfire residues, which are normally deposited in the downstream, so most of the time people look at wildfire residue effect in the upstream, where it is actually wildfire happened. But if you see 10 years or 5 years from after wildfire, those residue will not be there. They will be washed off and deposited in surface water. So you are interested in how the residue would impact water quality. So these residue have a lot of nutrients. So that's why there was a hypothesis that presence of these residue can increase pathogen concentrations. In fact, we found is opposite. The reason is these residue have nutrients, but they are not so high. They have also other things that could kill the pathogens. So that's just one study, the very first study to examine that. Now what we are doing is looking at how methane emissions or greenhouse emissions in wetland is affected by wildfire residue. In fact, what we found that if we have lots of deposit, that enhance the greenhouse gas emissions. Something that we are now writing that paper. Renan is leading that research, and we'll share